donating to the Wildlife Federation so we can keep these educational events going. So I'm Austin. I know a lot of you guys already, and I miss you. I kind of went off of, the big theme lately, which is social behavior and social distancing, to title this Bees, Let's Get Social. And when I made that title out, one of the first pictures that I thought about, or instances of what I thought about, was this one, which some of you may have experienced. This is Josh Arentz, who's one of instructors that often does a lot of natural history events, has done a lot for Wildlife Federation before he moved out west. But couple of things with this. Number one is I'm looking forward to the day that we can get back together and give hugs and kisses. And so I miss you guys a whole lot. Usually this time of year, we're doing like an advanced training somewhere. We're in person, we're having a good time, but it is what it is. And also I'd say that as a science educator, please consider continuing to social distance as much as possible and wear a mask. Germ theories are, real things. So let's get through this as quickly as possible. So the other thing I'll say is that I'm actually in outer space today. So I'm social distancing in a very safe manner. You see the background here, got oxygen pumping in. So things are good for me. And I hope the same is true for you. All right. Moving on. So what do I mean by, social behavior, and why does this whole, word fit into especially bees and some other insects? So entomologists, people that study insects, actually have a definition for social behavior that they call certain insects eusocial or truly social. And so that's what I mean when I say social insects. And those that fit that qualification have the following three qualities. Cooperative brood care. This just means that they cooperate in taking care of their offspring. Like I have to do with my three kids. But there are multiple individuals taking care of the developing larvae inside different insect colonies that exhibit social behavior. Number two, you have an overlapping of generations. So, inside the beehive that we'll explore today, we'll see individuals that are different ages. Some were born a week ago, some 2 weeks ago, some 3 weeks ago. Some are not even born yet. They're still in the egg stage. So there's this overlap of generations inside these colonies. And then there's also a division of labor, often based on reproductive and non-reproductive animals within the same colony. And so, for example, in the bees, we have worker bees, which you and I are mostly familiar with. And then we have things like the queen bee, and then the male bees, the drone bees. None of those individuals can live without the other. Drones can't live without, the worker bees. Worker bees can't live without queen bees. So they're truly social and interdependent on one another. They will not do well, with coronavirus, for example, and viruses affect them too. But anyway, so a number of different animals have figured out how to do this. Not that many really, but within the insect world, it's probably most ubiquitous. So the ones that have really done this are the ants. So the ants have done it. A lot of the wasps and the bees have figured out how to do this. There's some beetles that do this. There are even some mammals that tend to do this. But where social insects are found in nature, they're found to be very, very dominant because, to put things simply, teamwork makes dream work. I mean, every other insect has to do every single chore that exists for that insect to live. These individuals break things up and they specialize. And so their prevalence, their biomass, where they are present is usually topping and outdoing the other animals within those same ecosystems. So there's another reason that some of these social insects do quite well, and it's because many of them have complete metamorphosis. And so they have an egg stage, they have a larva stage, they have a pupal stage, and then they have an adult stage. So 4 different stages, and that pupal stage seems to be very advantageous for a lot of insects that exhibit that quality, because it's a place where they can go through hard times. Like, I wish I could actually just pupate right now until the coronavirus is gone, because even as an introvert, this is really getting to me. But these animals can pupate and deal with a winter or deal with a dry season. This is a very safe way to outlast hard times. And so insects that have complete metamorphosis tend to be the insects that are most species diverse across the globe. So anyway, social insects often have both those things going. They're social and they have complete metamorphosis. And so they do quite well, all else being equal. So we're going to explore bees today, because that's what I happen to have in my backyard. My son is keeping bees. He's brought me out of retirement, and we're having a good time with them. But I know sometimes I get a question up front, which is, what's the difference in a bee and a wasp? Okay, both bees and wasps can be social and have complete metamorphosis, but bees are typically fuzzy. I guess I maybe should have put, so there's bees there on the right of my screen, the 2 bumblebees there. They're being social. I guess I picked a fitting photograph. Anyway, that was one of my first labs walking around with the USC Sumter students. And we were walking, and then we looked down, and there are these 2 bees, doing their thing. And so we learned about the birds and the bees that day. But that's a queen. That's a future queen there, the large bee. And then I don't know. I think you guys can see my mouse. So that's the future queen, and she is reproducing with a male. He'll pass away in the late summer and die, but she'll find a place to live out the winter time. And early in the spring, if you notice these really big bumblebees hovering across the ground, those are the queens, and they're looking for a place to start up a new colony. Anyway, my point is, they're fuzzy. Bees are often very fuzzy compared to like wasps and yellowjackets. And they're fuzzy because they are using that fuzz often to collect pollen, which they use as a protein source to feed their offspring. Wasp, yellowjackets, this is a big queen yellowjacket that we found in our backyard this spring. Yeah, I'm glad I found her when we did, but she's shiny, she's elongate, less hairy. The wasp and yellowjackets often have a strong constriction between the thorax and the abdomen, so that's the difference. And wasp and yellowjackets are often collecting, they're often predators. They're good to have around because they clean your vegetables off, they get the caterpillars and off, and that kind of stuff. And they'll go for sugary stuff too, but the bees are really interested in pollen and sometimes nectar. So a couple of easy differences for you. They're both in the same group of insects, social behavior, complete metamorphosis many times. Sting, especially the females, can sting you. So, chainsaw going in the background there. Okay, so we're going to explore the honeybee hive today, because these are accessible, and they're a great way to explore social behavior and how these animals work. And plus, they're important to your garden and to wildlife and to your dinner table, because they produce pollination and thus the food that we need. Let's see. Do I need to minimize that? Yeah, why don't I do that, and then you can see my complete screen. Okay, so here are the girls here at the house, and we're going to walk through each one of these kind of individually, but there's just a glance. Now, this is a tour of a beehive. So on any tour, you get like a safety talk, right? So this is my safety talk. If you do bees, and if we decide to do a how to beekeeping class in the future, it'll be a little bit different, but this is just a simple tour. But in doing so, you want to be safe. So we always suit up. This is my youngest son. He's got his bee suit on and all that, being more protected than I am sometimes. But so we suit up. We make sure we're not going to get stung, at least not too much. And then we also have a smoker. You can see it in his hand there in the previous picture. But smoke tends to, there's still some confusion and debate about what exactly it does, but it's thought that it mimics the presence of a forest fire. And so, bees are living naturally in the forest and there's smoke, well, they know they might need to move. And so they will, gorge themselves on honey. They'll focus on filling up their guts with honey so as to leave with the most food that they can if they have to abscond and go to some other place. And so it distracts them, and you'll put the smoke in the hive. You wait about 2 minutes is the best time to go in. And when you pop the hive open, they're all just drinking, like a fish, sucking up honey instead of being focused on stinging me. The other thing is that bees, and this is the case for, a lot of insects, a lot of social insects. Termites, by the way, are another group of insects that have really figured out social behavior. But so many of them communicate not with sound, but with smell. And so they're emitting these smells out of the rear end, out of the abdomen. And the smells are telling the other organisms different things, like go sting the dude in the big white suit. And so if you put smoke in the way of those smells, then it sort of breaks down that communication. So you can have beehives with different attitudes, different personalities, just like kids. And some of them don't need a single puff of smoke. Others, my goodness, I keep it rolling on them the whole time that we're working in the bees. So we've taken our safety precautions. We got our bee suits on. We've smoked the hive. I'm in outer space, so I'm good to go. Hopefully y'all are safe. And we're going to move on into the hive. Now here's a picture of one of my kids' beehives. And I often get the question, why are you have this pretty little pastel colors for your honeybees? And that's because in the hive where I live, there's also a queen bee, and she likes those colors. And so we do those colors because she's in charge of, how things look around here. And so, but the bees don't really seem to care about the color of the hive. You get any kind of scrap paint that's left over at Lowe's or Ace or wherever and, slap it on there. Remember, bees in nature are going to live in any old place they can find. Honeybees, the advantage of them is that we've been able to domesticate them to some degree and cause them to grow in a way that we want them to. And so we can put them in these little boxes. But in nature, it's just on the left there is a cedar tree with a hole in it. This was up toward Rock Hill, I think is where I found this, or up in Lancaster County. And there's a hole in a cedar tree, and this is a big hive of bees. Now inside there is all the honeycomb and everything else. But other places they will sometimes reside. This is up in the soffit of my friend's gable, his house. He was worried about it. We can get into that later, but it's not too much of concern because usually there's a 2x6 right up here, and these bees are probably isolated here on the outside in the distal part of this barge rafter and container here. So, but yeah, they go wherever they can find a decent spot. That's what bees do. Having a box to live in is sort of a luxury for them. Okay, so moving on in, we've popped the lid to our beehive here, okay? And you'll see just a little bit of activity there on the top. This is one of the top boxes, okay? You might, let's see. So just real quick, these top boxes are skinnier or narrower than the box here on the bottom. And that's because these top boxes are for the production of honey. So most beekeepers will put a screen right above the large box. Okay, and that screen is just the right size so that it precludes the queen from getting up into the upper chambers. So all you have here is just honey. That way when you go and harvest, you get these boxes off. You don't have to worry about there being larvae in your honey and stuff like that. You may want to eat larvae for some reason, but I just like the pure honey. So we keep them separated, as the song goes. Anyway, so we're popping up the top one here, and these are the frames. Now, inside a hole in a tree, bees are going to make honeycomb all over the place. But inside this, we can put these nice little frames and cause the bees to put honeycomb exactly where we want it. My beehive is a mess. If any of you are beekeepers, you might be a little disappointed in me. But this is a fresh hive, and the girls, they clean it up. I mean, so I kind of let them do the work. You'll notice a dark substance here, kind of just parts of this comb that are darker than others. And that is a material it's got a little bit of beeswax in it, but the bees will go out and they harvest this stuff from the buds of trees. If you've ever seen trees that are wounded and they're bleeding sap and those kinds of things. And you'll see sometimes honeybees there, and you'd be curious, like, what is a honeybee doing on the bark of this tree? You know, but they're getting a material that they're or compounds that they're going to manufacture into this material called propolis. Propolis, and that's bee glue basically. It's a really hard structure, and if the space is too big and they don't like it being that big, they want to narrow it down or really glue stuff together, structure the hive, they put propolis in there. And that's what that dark stuff is. And so you really have to kind of use a pry bar to kind of get some of these open sometimes. All right, let's see. And moving down. So I just pulled one frame out of here, and you'll see what we call Honeycomb Foundation. Okay. And a few bees already starting to kind of clean it and work it. I've got a little bit of wire in here. This helps us when we harvest the honey to make sure that comb stays where it needs to be. But this is something that is manufactured. Okay. The bees can make it on their own, but if you want them to produce it in straight lines on these frames, you order these foundation honeycombs and you put them inside the bees. The boys built a lot of frames this winter to prepare for. And so, but this is the foundation that they're going to build the honeycomb. And the honeycomb is a really well-engineered facet of technology. I mean, it's hard to see here, but the honeycomb on one side of this frame is offset from the honeycomb on the other side. So these are hexagonal shapes, little hexagons. And what I'm saying is that the one on one side is a little bit lower than the one that's directly opposite of it. This adds to the strength of the honeycomb. It's going to hold a lot of important stuff that we're going to see here in just a minute. Honey, not the least of which. And so, anyway, it's very impressive. So moving on down here. All right, we're in the second box down now, in the pink one. And you see a lot more activity here, a few more bees, making their way around. And when we start to peel this apart, let's see. This will be a little choppy, but I'll stop it and we'll talk. So there's my pry bar over here. I'm breaking open the propolis and my bee gloves. I'm going to bring this frame on out, and that's decent enough. So there you go. Now that's the same thing we just looked at, except the girls here have actually started to develop some of this honeycomb. So I guess we're touring the beehive, so you got the structure that we've manufactured, the wood, right? But let's talk about what the girls are making here. And so honeycomb, this comes from 6 little glands that are on the abdomen, underside of the abdomen of the bees. So they're pumping this stuff out of their bodies. They're not getting honeycomb from flowers or anything. They're pumping this stuff out of their body, and they're manipulating in a way that forms these little hexagonal shapes, and they start to bring it out, horizontally on these frames. And it's not all the way horizontal. It's angled up at about 13 degrees because you don't want your honey, to spill out when you start to put it in here. So these are all, so these are all the worker bees here doing their thing. We're going to talk about all the little components here. But that soft glistening stuff that you're seeing in the middle, it's very light colored at this point. That's nectar. Okay. So they're going out, they're grabbing nectar, just like you see in like the honeysuckle that you play with the kids or whatever. And they're going to bring that back. They're going to put it in here, and they're going to slowly turn that into the good stuff that we're interested in. Let's see. So I'm going to work my way down. don't worry, we're going to talk about all these little components here, but this is the deep chamber where the queen is supposed to be hanging out. These frames are a little bit longer and deeper because we want plenty of eggs and larvae. Yeah, there we go. So girls are working hard. All these little caps here, that's pupated bees. So they've got a pupal stage, as we said. They're going to pop out of there in a few days, and they're going to be worker bees. I think that's okay. So let's move forward and kind of break all those components down. Let's look at the different things that are inside honeycomb. All right. When I got this up, I realized it was a little bit pixelated, but this is an old frame of honeycomb, so it's kind of clogged up. It doesn't look quite hexagonal anymore, but you can see the different stages of life that are in here. So believe it or not, these little things that look like miniature rice grains, sort of, those are eggs. So the queen has laid those, and all the ones that are empty of anything else have eggs in them. That's a really good sign. When you're a beekeeper and you're looking through, you definitely want to see the presence of the frames or the little holes being full of either eggs or, here we go, this white stuff that looks like a little grub. That's larvae. Those are baby bees. Yeah, so they grow up in there. They're fed in there. And then they're gonna pupate and come out. I mean, the worst part, like I remember learning about these. I mean, the part I was amazed by them, but I felt sorry for them that they couldn't go poo poo for a really long time. They're stuck inside these little cells, and their gut, they actually store all their feces until they become adult, and then they go out, chug some Miralax, and do their thing outside the hive when they become adults. But yeah, it's all taking place down in there. The queens, it takes about 16 days to make one of those. The worker bees, it's 20, 21 or so. I think drones are around 26. So they're in there for quite some time, but they're going to pop out as adult bees. Let's see. Oops, I didn't know I had that on video, but that's a good look at eggs and larvae. And as they get older, as I say, they cap them off so they can form pupae. Sometimes you'll see honeycomb cells that are bigger than the others, and they have larvae inside them that are bigger than the others. Those are male bees. So the drone bees are a little bigger. We'll take a look at one in a second. And if you see one of these honeycomb cells that's often on the bottom of the frame or out to the side, and it's really big, then there you have a queen bee, okay? So those are the different forms of life that are inside this honeycomb. Now, let's look at what do you feed all that life, right? So all baby bees for the first 3 days of their life are fed this substance called royal jelly. You can sometimes buy this. It's thought to be medicinal and that kind of thing. But anyway, it's a very nutritious substance that's fed to every bee for the first few parts of their life. Now, if a bee is going to grow up to be a queen, they will keep feeding royal jelly to it for the duration of its larval development. Okay, but if it's going to be a drone or a worker bee, after 3 days, they start feeding it what some beekeepers call bee bread, which is this yellow stuff off to the side. That is pollen and a little bit of mixture of honey and other compounds that come from the saliva of the bee. And pollen is rich in protein, so this is very conducive to the development of the larval bees. And this is stored often just right outside of where you see all the little grubs. They have the little yellow stuff just kind of out to the side so they can bring it closely to the bee. So that's protein. Pollen is protein, and it just comes from flowers. Here's a picture of a invasive rose that I can't get rid of. I mean, it's beautiful, so I'm okay with it. But there's a little honeybee on there, and she has a.
There's a worker bee,
Oops.
maybe from one of our hives.
Didn't know I was running my mouth in this, but if you look at the hind legs right there, bam, you see a big package of pollen. Okay, so they're out getting pollen. Doesn't come from nectar. I mean, pollen comes from pollen from the stamens of the flowers, and they move the pollen back upon their little hairs and on their legs to their hind legs, where there is actually a little concavity. It's like a little basket, truly, and there's little hairs that come up above it, and they push the pollen down in there. Pollen is sort of naturally sticky because it's interested in going to a different place. Um, but so the pollen can stick into that little concavity on the hind leg and be contained by those hairs. And even better, the bee has a little protrusion on one of its hind leg parts they can move it back and forth like you would flex your knee back and forth, and they can actually press the pollen, pack it. It's called a pollen press. A little tiny piece of leg that comes up and pushes that pollen down into this densely packed arrangement. They take that back. Somebody else usually grabs it and they package it into the honeycomb cells. So that's the reason they're interested in the pollen. Okay. All right. So here's what we're interested in developing to a degree. These are worker bees. So I said we're feeding both the one second. We're feeding everybody pollen, but we're also, you can start to see, I think in this part of the screen, maybe the clear glistening substance, as again, that's nectar. So you go out and you grab nectar, you bring it back, and then you start to actually move air through the hive. So inside a beehive, there are bees that are lined up at certain places inside the hive, and they're circulating air throughout the hive. That's there's sort of air conditioning, basically. They're keeping the hive cool, but they're also drying out the nectar. So, and they're adding enzymes to it and manipulating it in different ways. But they're interested in getting the nectar down to about 17% water. And when that happens, we call it honey. And it takes on this dark characteristic like you see in this picture. Okay, and when it's just right, they put a cap of wax over the top of it, just like you would put a cap on top of the jar that you're storing honey in. So that's how honey is made. It doesn't come from the pollen, it comes from the nectar of the flowers, and it's collected by worker bees, as we see in this picture. These are all females. They do the majority of the work. That's kind of how things happen sometimes. And let's see. The division of labor, we're going to talk about the different. So we got worker bees, we got queen bees, and we got drone bees. But the division of labor is not just that. It's not just that there's a worker and a queen, but within the worker bee group, there are also divisions of labor. Like some bees only are going out and collecting pollen. Some bees are only collecting nectar. Some are only collecting water to bring back for sustenance. Some are only collecting propolis. Some are just staying in the hive making beeswax. Some are just tending the queen. So that it's this super division of labor that makes them so successful. And a lot of what they do is dependent on their age. So it's kind of like, being in a house and having certain chores when you're young and different chores when you're older. So can't say too much because my kids might be listening, but there's lots that I want to say, if you know what I mean. But anyhow, so here's honey almost made, and the worker bees are responsible for that. And so this will be a little difficult, but bear with me. We're going to look for a male bee. So these are all workers in the middle, but oh gosh, stay calm. Here we go. Let me hit play. And down here on the right, we've got one bee that's a little chunkier than the others. And I'll try to stop it here because I know it's going to be choppy on your end when it focuses just right. Oh God. Bear with me. There he is. Boom. Right there, male bee. That's one of the boys. You know what he's doing? Nothing. He's just chilling. Um, you know, I know some boys that way, but they are mainly responsible for breeding with the queen. So they fly up in the air in the spring, find a queen, breed with her, and then they die actually after that. But if they're hanging around in the summer, usually the girls will push them out in the summer, in the late summer, because they're just taking up space in the spring, and they can make new drones next spring. So they don't want to take up space and sustenance of the wintertime. By the way, I forgot to mention, pollen is fed to the baby bees, but honey is the wintertime food source. So you know, in the winter when it's time to kick the drones out, we don't want to share our honey with too many people that you know, might not matter that much. But that's a male bee there in the middle, and he's just kind of he does what I do in my house: look busy. You just got to look busy, you know. When Karen gets home, I start moving around, you know, and just looking busy. And so here's another up close picture. Let's see. I think you can hold these. I sent this one to, that's not the best. I'm not sure why PowerPoint cuts it off for me, but you can hold these because they are males. So believe it or not, a stinger is nothing more than an egg laying apparatus. So it's been modified into something that can sting and pack a little poison into you, but it's only in the females. And so I've started to be able to recognize male bees and male carpenter bees and stuff like that. It's kind of fun to catch them and show kids that and maybe get a few bucks on bets, that kind of thing. But yeah, that's the male bee. All right, and kind of move forward here. All right, here's the good stuff. So there's the queen. Oh gosh, sorry. I don't have the best up close picture because I get really nervous when I find the queen because there's only one and I don't want to squish her. I don't want to leave her out of the hive for too long. Usually when I go in my hive or we go in Robert's hive, if we see lots of eggs and larvae, we don't really need to see the queen because she's doing her thing and we've got evidence that she's there and doing well. But just in the middle of your screen, I think this picture kind of is good too because it shows you the differential between the workers and the queen. She's maybe twice as long, but not quite as the other workers. My queen has a blue dot on her. Okay, that's only because the person from whom I purchased this queen and this colony had marked the queens. They don't walk around with blue dots on them in nature, but they put a blue dot. It codes for the year and that kind of thing of when you got them. And if you see a queen that doesn't have a blue dot, you know you've had a replacement queen. But that's the queen there, and she's going around. She's laying up to this time of year 2,000 eggs a day. So she's a busy girl, and I hate to interrupt her progress. And so I put this right back inside the hive there after I pulled it out. Okay, now the queen, as I say, she's laying lots of eggs, and people often hear of bees. They often hear of a swarm of bees. So I thought I'd talk about what a swarm is. So in the spring, when the hive gets extra crowded, the queen's laying lots of eggs. She will often lay eggs in honeycomb cells that are bigger than the others. Those are destined to become queens for that reason, but also because they're going to be fed a substance, the royal jelly, for the duration of their life. When that queen lays those eggs, okay, she's going to take a few more days to collect her belongings, and she actually goes on a diet because she wants to take flight and behooves her to be a little more lightweight. And then she flies away, and she brings with her about 50% of her worker bees. Okay, that's what you call a swarm of bees. So when I was first had met my my wife, I was kind of like not normal, and so things I would do, but like, you want to go catch a swarm of bees? It's really cool. And so we rode out to the bee yard. This is when I worked for Clemson and as a graduate student. And there was this big swarm of bees right here. This is several feet down. I don't know how many bees will be in here, but it weighed a substantial amount. And so we climbed up in the truck. We brought a box there and we sweetened it. We put a couple of frames of honey from another hive in there, give that branch a shake, and hope that you get the queen as well as enough of the workers to convince them that you have a good place for them to live. And all the ones that you missed will magically move into the entrance of the hive. It's really fun to watch. You've got worker bees on the outside that are sticking their little fannies up in the air and waving their wings and casting out these smells to tell everybody, hey, we've got a place that we like. And you've caught a swarm if you do that. Otherwise, this big ball of bees, they're sending out scouts all over the place. The scouts are coming back and they're saying, hey, I found a good tree hole. Hey, here's a nice place in Sarah Green's attic that I want to go. And, you know, they just are finding these different places. And so they actually vote. They're quite, this is the one time democracy works good in the bee colony, which is usually a monarchy, right? But they vote. And if it's, if it's 51%, they all go willingly to wherever that place is. But hopefully you catch them, and that way you can get catch some honey in the future. So meanwhile, okay, back in that old hive where 50% of the workers are still living and where there are developing future queens, one of those queens is going to hatch out of the pupal stage before the other ones. She's going to go around. She's going to open up the cells of the other queens and sting them to death. Okay, her stinger. Honeybees have a stinger with barb on it, like a fish hook, and so when they sting you, they actually it's suicidal. They die because the stinger and terminal nerve center and the poison sac stays in your skin and continues to pump, and the bee body goes away. So that's why they tell you to get the stinger out as quick as possible. But if you're a queen, you can sting over and over, and that's probably one of the reasons. You're going to sting all your sisters to death because there can only be one queen. And then once you've established your rulership, you're going to fly up in the air. You're going to mate with several drones, male bees, and you're going to acquire a lot of sperm, enough to last you, 4 or 5 years, for the duration of your life. You come back down and you start laying eggs. And that usually happens in the spring, and sometimes it can happen a couple of times in the spring, this swarming behavior. So it's almost like, so there's reproduction within the hive, but then there's the reproduction of the hive. I mean, and that's, so there's two ways to look at reproduction with the bees. So awesome.
Hey there, Austin.
Hey. Ooh, yes. Yes.
Dave wants to know, how is drone production regulated? Is it actually genetically different eggs or something in how the larvae are reared?
Yeah, great question. So it's an unfertilized egg, and it is regulated by the queen. So she quote unquote decides, how many workers, queens, that kind of, or workers, drones that are needed inside the hive. And so when she lays drone eggs, they simply divide. There's not, they're a precise. The cells just divide to make the drones, and they are precise. They're a clone of her because of that. And this is part of why. This is a longer story that we could get into maybe afterwards or whatever. But sister bees, worker bees, are like almost 75% related to one another, whereas most of the time in nature it's like 50% related to your sisters and that kind of thing. But because you're getting a direct copy from your dad and 50% from your mom, you average out at 75%, and it almost behooves you to take care of your sisters instead of setting up a family of your own. This is one of the reasons that social behavior seems to work. That's a tangent there, but so it's an unfertilized egg, and the queen is reading signals and determining which eggs she needs to lay. What is this? Oh, so this is, yeah. So one of the neat things about bees, I said that most of the time, how am I doing here? Oh gosh. All right, I'm close. Um, Most of the time they communicate with smell, but one of the neat things about them is they do have this little dance that they do. It's like the cha-cha slide or the boot scoot boogie and those kinds of things. This is called the waggle dance, the wagtail dance. And they're famous for this, you know, and it you'll see why. So if I can explain it right. So this is pretend this is just a frame of bees we're looking at, and it's got a vertical orientation. So straight up and down, you know, to the sun or wherever above, and the sky above. We're looking toward me in outer space. And the bees say they go out and they find this delicious, you know, flower on a tulip tree. They come back, they want to tell their friends about it. Well, what they'll do, and you'll see this when you break the hive open a lot of times, and this is why it fits into the tour. You'll see these bees zigzagging around. I meant to kind of stage this. They'll zigzag on a straight run off to the side. Then they'll come back around the top. They'll zigzag and same off to the left here, at least on my screen. They'll come around the circle. They'll zigzag back to the left again. It's almost like a figure eight, kind of a condensed figure eight. They keep doing this. Okay. Other bees will, I won't say they see it because it's pitch black dark inside a beehive almost, but they'll sense this. Okay. And this is telling them actually three different things. Number one, it's telling them that their friend has found something that they like, and they can smell the flower that their friend went to on the body of their friend. So it's telling them the quality of the nectar source that they went to. And the number of little waggles that occur on this straight run, okay, correlate pretty specifically to the distance away from the hive that the flower is that they want to go to. So more wags equals greater distance, less wags equals the flower is closer to the hive. Okay, so two things so far there, quality and distance, but it also gives you direction. So let's say the little bee is doing the track we said. It's going wagging this way, back around, wagging this way, back around. If that angle, if that straight run, they call it, even though they're wagging, if that straight run is 90 degrees from vertical, okay, if this straight run is 90 degrees from vertical orientation, that means that their friends need to go out to the front door of the beehive, okay? They need to find the sunshine and do some trigonometry and fly 90 degrees to the left of the sunshine. Just like we're 90 degrees to the left of vertical here, we fly 90 degrees to the left of the sunshine, the appropriate distance, we will find a flower of our choice. Isn't that crazy? And think about this. This happens despite the fact that there's trees in the way, there's skyscrapers, they're doing all kinds of trigonometry to figure out and still land in the same place. This is the waggle dance, and one of the reasons that honeybees are famous. Incidentally, some of the research more recently is showing that they're not always dependent on this. They can do without it. Sometimes they don't listen to the individuals that are trying to convey this information. And so, but it's still a pretty awesome feat that has served them great advantage. I just like to say that, you know, we always think intelligent life is, you know, Homo sapiens, and I don't know about that, but bees, I mean, these insects are intelligent too. They're doing some pretty, I mean, I can't do trigonometry. I try to help my kids on their homework, and I don't know what they're doing, but anyway, good stuff. That's the waggle dance. I know I haven't talked about honey. I thought about this. So the honey is their wintertime food source. We don't want to be greedy. If one box on our beehives are full, I'm going to leave that for the bees. If more than that's full, I'll probably take some of that off. And so you just pull these frames out. By then, they're all capped off. You take a hot knife, you plug it in, it heats up, you cut the caps off. Okay, it goes in this, this machine here is a centrifuge, basically. It's got little places where I can put the frames. I turn the switch on, it spins around. Out comes the honey. I try to get the kids to save me some. Then we take this little barrel on the bottom, we take it inside the house, we let it settle, and then we, after a few days, we put it into the bottles. So, but again, honey is you know, bumblebees, yellow jackets, wasps, they don't live through the winter other than the queen, but honeybees live through the winter. So they need food to do that. And honey is their wintertime food source. And lastly, before I take some questions, let me put a plug in for other bees, especially native bees. Honeybees are not native to the US. They came here with our early ancestors and, you know, possibly displaced some of our native pollinators. Who knows? But we have about, you know, 4,000 in North America, native bees, several hundred bees known from South Carolina alone. These things, if we just give them space, they have what they need. I mean, a lot of the, so for example, on the left, here's a blueberry bee. Those little bare patches in your lawn, right? That, you know, my neighbor's always showing me, hey, let me show you this new fertilizer. And I try to act like I care and stuff, but I just don't. And the bare spots in my lawn have these little holes in them. Those are inhabited by blueberry bees, southeastern blueberry bees, and they're early spring pollinators. They look like miniature bumblebees. Really important to our blueberry crops. You know, native bumblebees are still hanging in there to some degree. Carpenter bees, even, it's hard to love them sometimes. That's the black micans species there. But anyway, just natural habitat, and especially bare space. Actually, the bee capital of the world is like the Southwest, where it's like deserty, and there's more bee diversity out there than anywhere else. And so this barren ground where bees can get in and make a safe home in the ground tends to be quite useful for them. So you can actually keep these things, not as easily as you do honeybees, but they're on the left. If you look up something called a blue orchard bee, you can find all kinds of directions for how to make a little box hive. You can even, I've seen these at Tractor Supply, but I just made a little box and stuck old Joe Pye weed and all kind of just milkweed stems and stuff in there, and rolled up pieces of paper, you know, so those kinds of things work. And you can even make a bumblebee hive to try to, it's not as successful when those queens are flying around early spring. You can sometimes get them to move in to your area. So resources, there's lots out there, but our Wildlife Federation has a great website about gardening for wildlife. There is a South Carolina State Beekeepers Association that has links to all the local clubs. Beekeeping's like the thing, you know. It's amazing how popular it's gotten in the last 10 years. It's tough. The bees have a lot of invasive species that are hitting them, so you have to sort of pamper them more than you did when I was doing this 20 years ago. But there's a lot of local people your way that are doing this, and you can get involved with them. And to plant certain plants that are bee attractions, the Wildlife Federation page and the Native Plant Society have some good information on that. So anyhow, I did better than the last time. I've got 10 minutes before an hour. So if you're on lunch break, I'm sorry if I got too close, but if not, I'm happy to hang out if there are questions and address any of those.
Yeah, we've already got a couple questions in here from Sharon. She wants to know, do all types of bees make honey that humans can consume?
No, most do not. It's mostly just honeybees and a couple of closely related honeybees. There's a stingless honeybee. Bumblebees will make a little bit of honey for their developing babies. They make a little honey pot, but it's not in an amount that is something we could harvest. So yeah, so the honeybees, you know, fairly unique in the world of bees for making this wintertime food source.
Kate wants to know, at a hive in nature, are the eggs, honey, and larva and pupa all mixed together rather than separated like in a man-made hive?
Yeah, good question. They are still separated to the degree that it makes it, you know, useful. It's sort of like in the same way that tasks and chores are separated. Efficiency inside a hive is best when you have all the eggs and larvae sort of centered, okay? And then right outside you have your pollen and or your honey that you're bringing to the center. And the reason for that is that in the wintertime, bees form this cluster. And they're gonna, even in the wintertime, they'll have some eggs and larvae developing, but have to keep their heat at a certain level in order to survive. So if they can keep the eggs and the larvae in the middle of that cluster of bees, centered inside the tree cavity, wherever it is, that's the best bet for most of the bees to survive.
Greg wants to know, have warming temperatures had a significant impact yet on the distribution of our native bee species?
Yeah, great question. So they one of the ones that rings a bell is if you ever heard of killer bees before, this was the sort of the media name for a type of honeybee that came out of the tropics. So that short answer is yes, it has, and this is just one example. Okay, and so the Africanized bees, so-called killer bees, were a bee down in South America, and the honeybees down there, you know, that still had an old world origin. They were just not that great at producing nectar. And so a scientist brought over some bees from Africa and bred those bees with these bees that were in the tropics to try to make a more successful honey producing bee. Those became the so-called killer bees, the Africanized bees. And they have a tendency to sometimes be quite aggressive, but they do make more honey than the original stock did. And they have slowly, some of this has been augmented by us, taking bees in certain places. Like when I was working for the Bee Lab in Clemson, this was a long time ago. There was a plane that landed at the Donaldson Center and had a wing that was full of a hive of Africanized bees that had come out of Texas, where the bees were at that time. So we've kind of taken these bees to new places, but they have also expanded their range naturally. So the Africanized bees have moved up into from Florida up into Georgia, for example, and even we found a colony or two in South Carolina in the past couple of years. They're becoming actually a favorite of a lot of beekeepers because they do make more honey in tropical situations and in warmer situations. So as our climate tends to warm, they tend to creep up and up. So sorry, I'm rambling, but
Always
that would be one example. So yeah.
Always good to get a climate change related question in there.
Yeah, it's definitely affecting them.
Sharon wants to know, has the source of hive colony collapse been found? Is it related to use of things like Roundup, other herbicides?
Yeah. So the best, no, it's not been found, other than to say that it's a list of about 5 or 6 things. And one of those things does include, pesticide use. The neonics, for example, is a short word for the longer name of some pesticides like imidacloprid that are used in agricultural settings, are brought home by the bees, and they do change the behavior of the bees, in the life cycle and can cause detriment. We've had examples, very direct examples, of some of the sprays that go out for sometimes mosquitoes and other things that have caused detriment to the bees. So that's certainly putting a strain on them. But also there's a Varroa Mite, which is a mite that our bees are not used to. They didn't grow up dealing with these mites, okay, in the course of evolution. And so we have to put medicines on our bees to get rid of the mites during the late summer, for example, because they suck the blood out of the bees and shorten their lifespan. But the Africanized bees have a behavioral trait that causes them to not have mites. They groom them, they get rid of the mites. So that's another reason the beekeepers are sort of like, I can deal with a little more aggressive of a colony, and they don't have any mite issues. So it's that. There's a virus going around, not coronavirus, thank goodness, but acute Israeli paralysis, I think it's called. It's interesting. It alters the behavior of a worker bee, and enables the worker bee to go inside the hive that's not theirs. and the bees from that other hive don't recognize it. It disguises itself and behaviorally to move into that hive and thus disseminate this new virus. I mean, 'tis the season for viruses, right? But isn't that crazy what they can do? So it's a list of a number of things that are causing bees a good bit of stress. But I still have a hopeful outlook on the bees because we are so concentrated on taking care of honeybees. I mean, there's a lot of effort that goes into making sure these girls are going to be okay. So I think we're going to hopefully, manage that situation.
We still have a couple more questions.
Sure.
One wants to know, have you ever had success with saving a hive that has gone queenless so that a laying worker is developed?
Yeah. All right. Yeah, good question. So one of the chemicals that gets passed around in a beehive is a chemical that suppresses the reproductive system, and especially the egg laying system of the worker bees. But when the queen dies for some reason, or for whatever reason, the workers can develop their ovaries enough to where they will lay eggs. Now, all those eggs are going to be unfertilized. They're going to turn into male bees. And when they start doing this, in my experience, it's been difficult to get them to change their behavior. Okay. So that's one of the reasons you kind of want to stay on top of your hive. And when you lose a queen, you hopefully know right away. Usually if she's still got eggs that are still young, or larvae that are not 3 days beyond age, the bees will know that the queen has died, and they'll feed those larvae royal jelly. They'll turn a worker bee, what would have been a worker bee, they'll widen the honeycomb, they'll make it bigger, and they'll make it into a new queen. The other thing I've done is gone and gotten, if I don't see any eggs in there or larvae that are young enough to turn into queens, I've gone to another hive and brushed off all the worker bees and stick it inside the queenless hive, and they will turn some of those eggs into queens. So it's hard when the workers have started laying, but if you can get them before that, it's usually successful.
Kim wants to know, where have Africanized honeybees been found in South Carolina in the last couple of years?
Yeah, the news feed I got, it was out of Charleston, and I don't know if it was through the USDA was reporting that, but I think it was in the it's like Charleston or Beaufort County, something like that, and they were eradicated, but they're in Florida, they're in Georgia. Back to the climate question, they were stuck in East Texas for a while, and we weren't sure why. Maybe some kind of ecological barrier existed there that prevented them from moving east. But then they hopped either a ship or a plane over to Florida, and then since then they've been making their way north. So they're up into Florida and Georgia now, and I think it's, I don't remember what our latitude, 32 or 33. They're not predicted right now to move much above the latitude of Atlanta, Georgia, which is about where we are. And but as climate warms, they seem to be trekking farther and farther, north. So,
all right. Greg says,
but they were.
Oh, go ahead.
Now, I was just saying they were sensationalized. I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about it. If you're allergic to bee stings, you need to always have an EpiPen when you're out and about. But they were sensationalized, a lot like this murder hornet, which we can talk about if you want to. But that thing's got a long way to go before it gets to South Carolina, and it's just I don't think we need to worry about them quite as much as the media has sometimes announced.
Greg wants to know, do you have top 5 or top 10 list of native plants for attracting bees? Greg, we'll make sure to follow up with the SCWF list, but Austin, do you have any favorites?
Yeah, and it's funny because I used to think just plant flowers, any old flowers kind of thing, but bees do preferentially choose. They're hitting about 4 or 5 plants at a time. And those, in other words, one of their favorites is tulip trees. So those flowers are way up at the top of the sky, and you don't get to notice that a whole lot times. But if tulip trees are in bloom, they're not going to waste their time on the flowers in your backyard. If you see some on the flowers in your backyard at that time of year, that's usually scout bees. They're just kind of learning the terrain and figure out where to go. But some of the biggest nectar producers, at least in the Midlands, are tulip tree or tulip poplar. But Rudy told me not to call it poplar, so I call it tulip tree. That's Liriodendron. And then hollies. Hollies are just booming. I mean, we were out bike riding and walking one evening, and I was underneath a tree, and I heard this buzzing. I'm thinking there must be a swarm up there of bees. And I looked up, but it was just the bees hitting the blooms of the holly trees. They seem to have hit the female and male holly trees equally well. And so let's see, that's 2. You were asking for 5. Right now, my mountain mint, if you want like a backyard flower, mints, bee balms, those kinds of things, they're covered with honeybees right now. Joe Pye weeds are great for the honeybees. Clover, you know, my wife wants to get rid of the clover in our grass and stuff, but I mean, it's covered in honeybees, just the regular old white clover, and it makes a great, delicious honey as well. Sourwood honey is famous, but it doesn't tend to, sourwood in the Midlands doesn't tend to yield the honey that it does in the mountains for some reason. So, but those would be, let's see, yeah, those would be a handful. In the late summer, Carolina aster just pulls in a ton of pollinators, including honeybees, and button bush would be another one that I have in my yard that's really good for them.
Kate wanted clarification. So she said pollen is for feeding the larva and the nectar is for making honey?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, good question, because it's strange. I mean, you see nectar. I mean, how could that turn into honey? But they bring a ton of it back. You know, it's not a lot of bang for the buck. Ton of nectar, take out the water of the nectar, and it's going to be honey. You just got to get the sugar concentration right. And so, but yeah, pollen is brought back, and it's mixed with the honey sometimes to feed the bees, but primarily pollen is what's being fed to the baby bees, larvae.
And Charlotte said, how would you know if you had killer bees?
Well, yeah, it's, yeah, you find out the hard way, right, Charlotte? Gosh, you don't want to do that. There are some, it's very difficult. I think the analyses that were, this was 20 years ago, so it maybe didn't, but it was, the size of them was a little bit different. But it is mostly behavior. It's mostly behavior that tells you these things. And I think the good thing about honeybees, I mean, I don't know if it's good or not, but when they're alive in nature, they're often like the one that I showed you the picture of my friend's house. And those bees were up in the gable there. And I said, you know, I would just leave them alone. They're 15, 20 feet up. They have no interest in you. Okay. Yellowjackets and bumblebees, they nest down in the ground and stuff. You're much more likely to come in contact with them. Honeybees are unlikely to be in a hive that's, you know, low and where you would interact with it. They're in a tree cavity, usually up a little bit higher than you would have. So, you know, he's going to leave that hive alone. We're going to, I think it'll probably, because it's most likely, at least in this area, to be a European honeybee hive, it's probably going to die. Most of the wild hives now do not live because of the Varroa mites and the colony collapse issues. I said it's probably going to perish in the winter time anyway, and it doesn't seem to be inside his interior wall. So I told him to leave it be, and if they don't go away, we'll go in the winter and get some honey.
If you have a carpenter bee problem, let's say carpenter bees have discovered that they love your husband's shed, in my case, what would you recommend?
You know, this is going to sound cavalier, but I didn't say this. I'm a messenger here, but this is what my friend does. He gets, find a kid who needs some, you know, batting practice. I mean, because you are asking, like, how do I kill him? I think that's what you're saying. So, you know, tennis rackets or batting practice on the males. If you notice some of the bees that are just hovering in the same place, those are male bees. and they're looking for a female. They have a yellow face. They can't sting in the first place. But, reducing their numbers is something that is sort of a little bit easier than getting the females. The short answer is there's not a good solution. I've had some people put, pesticides up in the holes. You can replace some of the wood that they've infested, but their cavities are up in there. They go off at right angles from the main hallway, and they put their larvae in there, and so it's just unfortunately a tough thing to beat. And if anybody comes up with that answer, you're going to be rich in a pretty quick order. There are bee traps. So there's Carpenter Bee traps that are available at stores, that are available online, and they do work. You will harvest a good number of Carpenter bees. So that's kind of the answer. You just have to manage it. There's not right now a great way to get rid of them, but managing it with traps, with pesticides, with little kids who, I don't know if you want to teach them that, but anyway, if you're just like have all this pent up anger and you want to go get rid of them, you can get some of the males in the midair.
Sharon wants to know, how do ground bees differ from other bees?
Ground bees are mostly, I had a call this, I get these calls all the time, and my neighbor back this way on this other planet, am I still in outer space?
You are.
Anyway, she had all these ground bees, and she was worried about them. And so I tried to calm her fears. I walked out in the middle of it, and there was thousands. There was literally thousands of these little bees. They're called andrinid bees. One of the very common ground bee families is Andrenidae, Andrenidae. And I walked all through them, back and forth, and I said, they're not defensive. So they are not social. They're not fully social. Most of the time, these ground bees are not fully social. They have individual little crevices, holes that they live in. And so they don't have this big teamwork nest need to defend like honeybees or yellowjackets or wasps do. So that's the one big difference, is they're not very aggressive, and they're not social. They don't have reproductive, care and division of labor and all that kind of thing. They don't make honey, but they do pollinate, and ounce for ounce, they're often better pollinators than honeybees are. They're sometimes less preferential, like a honeybee's just going where it's going to get some nectar. The ground bees are going wherever they get pollen, and they're often able to feed and move in colder temperatures sometimes than honeybees. And so, those would be a few differences, and they're very, very important. There's a good book. Doggone, I just now thought of it. We can get it in the follow-up email, but I think it's called Bees in Your Backyard. Yeah, and it was put out a couple of years ago, and it's a great resource, natural history as well as identification of backyard bees.
Awesome. So far, that's it for questions. Anybody have a last minute question they want to jump in for Austin? Otherwise, we will wrap things up.
Peace out. Wear a mask. Miss you guys.
Hopefully we will see everybody soon. All right, we will go ahead and close up. Thank you, Austin. Be sure to check out scwf.org for future classes and events. We'd love to see you there. Bye, everyone.